Hello, welcome to Lils Intertrelled, welcome to Tudor-Tember, and welcome to the first official episode in Rethinking the Six Wives of Henry VIII. Today we are talking Katherine of Aragon. So Katherine of Aragon, if you don't know who she was the first wife of Henry VIII and mother to Mary, who later became Mary I of England. So what legacies have been left of Catherine? When people think of Catherine, what is the things that spring to mind around her? Well, people often think of her as the woman who couldn't produce a male heir. They think of her as a woman who got cast aside for a woman of low birth, and people also think of her as someone who got banished to die alone. So let's quickly go through these before we set ourselves some new legacies to move forward. Now, first of all, let's go through each of these legacies and talk about them, get rid of them, and come up with some new ones. So first of all, couldn't produce a male heir. Now this I find a little bit offensive, to be honest, as something that people say about Catherine. Catherine did produce a male heir. She actually produced many children. She had many pregnancies. They often ended in miscarriages, stillbirths, or infants who died shortly after birth, some living a few hours, some living a few days. There was one child in particular who was born on New Year's Day 1511, and he was a little baby boy. At that time, Catherine was the wife of a king and also the mother of a prince, and Henry was so in love with her, and Catherine's stability was untouchable. She was absolutely riding high. She was so in love with her husband. She was the mother of a prince. She had an heir. Henry had his heir, and everyone was so happy. Beacons were lit. Cannons were fired, wine was given out to the London citizens, and people in London had a party and they celebrated the birth of little Prince Henry. He had himself a household full of staff, people to rock his royal cradle, and he had the most amazing clothing and toys for a little baby. However, of course, he was not succeeded by Henry IX. And that is because little Henry passed away in February of the same year, 1511. He lived for only 52 days. Now this is very crushing. It's crushing because this is a king and a queen who have lost their heir. Of course it's devastating because a mother and father have lost their son. Even at a time where infant mortality is very high, it's still heartbreaking to lose your child, and it absolutely broke Catherine, the death of little Henry. And so when we think of Catherine not being able to produce a male heir, I think we need to be a bit kinder about this, because she did. But for whatever reason, Catherine thought it was God's will, but for whatever reason, little Henry and the others were taken away from her. The next thing we need to talk about, the next legacy that's been left of Catherine through history, is that she got cast aside for a woman of low birth. Now, of course, we're here, we talk about Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn was not a woman of low birth. I don't know why, but people tend to think of her as like this peasant. She wasn't. Have you been to Hever Castle? It's very nice. She wasn't a peasant at all. No, of course, she's nowhere near Catherine's standard. Catherine was a princess. Anne was not. But still, she wasn't a peasant. And the last legacy that's been left of her is that she was banished to die alone. And sadly, this is sort of true. Henry, his relationship with Catherine by the end was really fraught, and it was really difficult for Catherine because she was just going into worse and worse circumstances, and she, by the end, had very few women around her. She was not allowed her daughter around her, and she was just her and a few ladies, and that was pretty much it. going from worse to worse circumstances, and definitely not circumstances befitting a woman of her station. It's quite sad. So hopefully we've got rid of those myths, we've debunked those myths, those legacies that have been left of her. Let's think of new legacies about Catherine moving forward. The legacies that I believe Catherine deserves are, first of all, that she was a mysterious Spanish beauty. Secondly, that she was a warrior queen. Thirdly, that she was loyal and loving to Henry until the end. And fourthly, Henry's true wife and queen. So let's talk about the first legacy, mysterious Spanish beauty. So Catherine first came to England in November of 1501, and she came to marry Prince Arthur. She was just shy of her 16th birthday, and when she came, people were amazed by her. They found her really mysterious because, of course, here was the wonderful fairy tale thing. This was an English prince marrying a foreign princess. A prince marrying a princess. How lovely. And she came here, as I said, she was just shy of being 16, and she was beautiful. She was good looking, she had this light auburn hair, she looked every inch the Spanish princess, and people were fascinated by her. I think there's also a really interesting aspect of language here, because Catherine and Arthur had to converse in Latin, which was their common language. Catherine did learn to speak and write and read in English eventually, but at the moment it was Latin. And I think there's something quite alluring about having to speak in a different language. I also think that part of the reason why Henry chose her as his wife was because of her looks. I mean, when Henry came to the throne after the father of his dad, Henry VII, in April of 1509, he had the choice. He was almost 18 and he could choose who he wanted. He said he was fulfilling his father's wishes, but I actually think that Catherine's looks, as well as lots of other good things, I mean, it was a good match, let's be honest. She was a daughter of Isabel of Castile, Ferdinand of Aragon. It was a good match politically, it was a good match religiously. It was just generally over a good match. But Henry did have to be attracted to her, and I think he certainly was. I think when we watch a lot of adaptations about the Tudor period and the Six Wives of Henry VIII, we always join Catherine when she's that bit older, when their marriage isn't going as well as it could be. And Catherine has had a real difficult life by this point. A lot of problems, not with conceiving, but with coming to terms with pregnancy and giving birth, etc., have taken a toll on her and her stress levels. And I think when we come to Catherine, we see that image constantly, but we forget that actually she was only a mere teenager when she first came to England. She was very young and beautiful and every inch the Spanish princess, so we need to remember how beautiful she was. And if you need reminding, there are portraits of Catherine that you can see her beauty in for you to see. The next legacy that I believe Catherine deserves is that she was the warrior queen. Now, her mother Isabella of Castile is actually nicknamed the warrior queen, but I believe Catherine deserves this legacy too. From a very young age, Catherine knew that she was going to go to England and marry the prince, become a princess, and one day become Queen of England. She was betrothed from a really young age. It was all done, dusted and sorted, and so in 1501 off she went. For her, it was her destiny. It was going to be her life's work. It was how she was going to devote herself. Because of the betrothal so young, Isabella of Castile, Catherine's mother, gave Catherine a really impressive education. It was an education unlike a lot of women of that time, and actually kind of unlike a lot of princesses at the time, because Isabella of Castile wasn't raising her daughter to be a good queen consort and, you know, to be a woman of the people, to listen and to produce heirs. She was raising her to rule, and to rule in her own name, essentially. And so she gave her a really impressive education, one befitting a queen in her own right. And I think Sir Thomas More puts it really well when he wrote, "She is descended from great kings, and she will be the mother of great kings." Now, of course, sadly, she doesn't produce great kings. She produces Mary, who I find fascinating. But she definitely does descend from great kings. And she herself is warrior enough to be king. Catherine got to show off her warrior side at the end of June in 1513. Henry goes off to fight his old enemy, the French, of course, and the last thing that he does before he leaves is to create Catherine regent. So this isn't just Catherine is queen consort anymore, she is regent, she is ruling. People have to listen to everything that she has to say. Of course she is ruling in Henry's name, but she is in charge. Impressive. So her education that her mother has given her now comes in good stead, and she does an amazing good job at ruling the country. And then something happens. Henry is away fighting. He does good things in France. He captures a couple of towns. He's very happy. Nothing amazing, but it's good in terms of English history invasion, good. Up Scotland way, James IV, Henry VIII's brother, married to his sister Margaret. He decides, I'm going to take advantage today. While the cat's away and Henry's in France, the mice will play. So James decides to invade England. Catherine, she's on it, it's fine. They end up meeting in Flodden, and that is where the Scots are completely annihilated. And amongst their dead is the king himself. Impressive, right, for Catherine? And she decides that she will send a token of this battle to Henry. So she sends the blood-stained cloak of James IV himself. And a letter too, in which they have this sort of wonderful bantering about what she's managed to achieve and what he's achieved. Of course, all done in his name, obviously. But as well as warrior when she's regent, I think she shows her warrior side when she has to fight for her marriage. The next legacy I believe Catherine deserves to be remembered for is that she was loyal and loving to Henry. There is a last letter that Catherine wrote to Henry. Now there is some debate as whether this is a true letter or not, but even if it's not, it's a really interesting piece of historic detail, because this last letter gives us a real insight into their relationship. And to be honest, it's quite sad, because it's quite clear that she loves Henry, and she always has done. In the last letter, she doesn't give up on Henry. She tries to save his soul, because by this point, of course, he has changed the religion of England on its head. He has gone through with the Reformation, and she believes what he has done is really damaging to not only the people of England, but him himself and his soul, and she tries to save him from damnation. She, in that letter, also forgives him, which is astonishing. And she also asks him to be a good father to Mary, because he does love Mary, but he has a very difficult relationship with Mary. She adores Mary, and she gave Mary an education like her mother gave her, because for Catherine, the only rightful heir to the throne at this point is of course Mary. Mary is her daughter and Henry's daughter, and she should rule next. For Catherine, it was her destiny to be Queen of England, and whoever she was married to, she would love. But I truly believed that she was in love with Henry, and I do believe at some point he was in love with her in the early years, and especially when they have little Henry himself. Back in the very early days in 1511, he was very much in love with her. For Catherine, her life was devoted to her religion. Her faith underpinned her whole existence. But so did the man that surrounded her, Henry. Henry was an integral part of Catherine's life. Whoever she was made to marry, she would love and devote herself to. And so she put up with so much from him. She put up with his moods and his tempers, which he did have, obviously particularly at the end. She put up with his mistresses that he had. He did have a few, we tend to think of him as like this playboy prince. He wasn't that at all, but he did have a few mistresses. One of which, of course, was Elizabeth Blount, Bessie Blount. Bessie Blount and Henry had a relationship. She was his mistress. and she actually gave birth to a child, and that child was a boy. The boy was named Henry Fitzroy. Fitzroy means son of a king, and Henry Fitzroy was so loved by King Henry. Henry Fitzroy was given titles, he was given land. There was a point where it looked like Henry Fitzroy was going to be above Mary somehow, the legitimate daughter of Henry VIII. And Catherine, through all of that, still loved her husband. All the way to the end. Because it was her destiny to be Queen of England and to love her husband. God had told her so. The last legacy I believe that she deserves to have is that she was Henry VIII's true wife and queen. Because of course, she was. She was destined to be Queen of England from when she was a child. She'd grown up going to little princess school, learning how to be the best Queen of England that she could possibly be, and the best wife to a great king, which she was. For Catherine, it was her God-given right to be queen. This is what God had asked her to do on earth, and therefore she wasn't going to give it up without a fight. When in around 1527-ish, Henry VIII decided, I don't want you anymore, love. I want to marry Anne Boleyn over there. She refused to go. Henry asked her to leave. She said no thank you. Well, she didn't say no thank you, she said no. And she proved to be made of stern stuff. She was then asked by Henry to keep it quiet, keep it on the low down, and she went, nah. And what she did was she wrote to her nephew, Emperor Charles V, the most powerful man in Europe, who just happens to be her nephew as well, to help her. Which he did. She always insisted on being known as Catherine the Queen right up to the end because she truly believed she was. And for Catherine, her God was her world and God was her life. She was devoted to her religion. Her religion was the most important part of her. And she believed that God believed in her marriage. And that only God could break that marriage and break it through death and nothing else. And that's why she stuck to being Henry's true wife and queen and holding on to that. Of course, the other great thing about this was that the people of England completely agreed with her wholeheartedly. They adored Catherine. Catherine was a wonderful wife, a wonderful queen, not just to Henry, but to the people, and the people adored her, and they believed in her marriage to Henry too, and they didn't agree with the marriage of Henry to Anne Boleyn. If Catherine had given birth to a son that had lived, Catherine would have been untouchable. However, due to Henry having an illegitimate child, Henry Fitzroy, with his mistress Bessie Blount, with the miscarriages, the stillbirths, and the very sad deaths of her children, living only a few days or a few hours or just a few weeks, Catherine, Henry felt, could be moved. Of course, it was never Catherine's fault, any of this. It's not her fault. She had no problem conceiving, it was just coming all the way to full term and then giving birth to a healthy child. That was the difficulty. It wasn't her fault, but it was seen as her failure and her problem, no one else's. And so Henry wanted to replace her. I always find it very interesting that people really undermined Catherine. When the marriage is on trial, and you have Cardinal Wolsey and Cardinal Campeggio, and they think the biggest weakness in Catherine is going to be Catherine herself, but actually she proves to be the strongest part of the story. She was a really interesting woman. And therefore, all these things that aren't her fault, and all these things that make her a great great queen, make her Henry's true wife and queen. So the next time you think of Katherine of Aragon, or you talk to someone about Katherine of Aragon, and they say to you some out-of-date things about her, just tell them that she was a beautiful Spanish woman, devoted to her God and her king, was loyal, loving of her people, and a true warrior queen. I hope you have enjoyed this little mini documentary. If you have, please give it a big thumbs up. Chat to me in the comments all things Katherine of Aragon, and I shall see you soon for my next video. Take care for now. Bye.